I've hired hundreds of employees and conducted thousands of interviews, and my goal is that by the end of this video, your next interview leads you to a job offer. That's it for the intro. Let's get right into it. The first thing you want to do before the interview even starts, the moment you know that you're getting the interview, is you want to make sure you know your audience. Your audience is twofold here. One is the company that you're interviewing for, so make sure you know everything there is to know about that company. You want to make sure if there's any public information that's available about that company, you have learned it. The last thing you want to do is be in an interview where someone asks you a question about the company that is something that you could have figured out by just reading the website and you don't know the answer. It just shows that you don't care about the job and that you're not fully prepared. So get to know the company really well. But in addition to knowing the company, you should also try and get to know the person who is interviewing you. So if you have been told who's going to be interviewing you, that makes this really easy, because at that point, all you're going to do is you're going to Google this person, try and find them on LinkedIn, try and figure out what their accomplishments are, what their background is, what their personal interests are, if they have an internet presence where they publish that kind of stuff. It's just going to help you connect with the interviewer a little bit better on a personal level, and it's going to help that conversation go a little bit more smoothly. Now, what if you haven't been told who's going to be conducting the interview? Well, in that case, what I like to do is just plain ask. Ask who is going to be conducting my interview. It is a very reasonable question. The recruiter who's reaching out to you or the HR specialist who's reaching out to you is not going to find it weird. In fact, they will probably give you the answer right away. Or in some cases, maybe it's a panel interview and they don't necessarily know exactly who's going to be on the panel, in which case they might say, we're not sure yet. In which case, that's fine. Just make sure you know the company really, really well. But if you don't know who's going to be interviewing you, there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking the question and then getting to know those people a little bit better, because it'll help you make a connection in the interview. The next important part of prepping for an interview is preparing yourself for the most common questions for the job that you're interviewing for. Now, this is really important because most interviews have the same structure. There are only so many questions that you can ask a potential candidate, and so it actually is not all that difficult to prepare for an interview. However, the mistake that a lot of candidates will make when they are preparing for an interview is that they'll prepare for sort of the very generic questions that can apply to any job, like, why do you want this job? What makes you think you're qualified for this job? But where they won't dive in a little bit deeper is they won't look for the questions that are going to be specific to the specific job that they're applying for. So it's not good enough just to prepare for the most common interview questions in general. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go on to your search engine of choice and type in common interview questions for job X, data analyst, social media marketer, dental hygienist, whatever it is. And you are going to for sure find a list of questions that are available online of things that are going to be common questions that you'll receive. So make sure you take that step. Now, the thing that I don't want you to do, though, is don't go and search for the best answers to those questions unless you really, really trust the source. Because whereas it's really easy to come up with a list of common questions, not everyone is super good at coming up with really good answers to those questions. So one of the things that is an easy trap to fall into is to sort of prepare by memorizing other answers to these questions that you find online. And that has two problems. One, it's not going to be personal to you, and that's going to come through in the interview, and it's going to feel fake, and it's going to feel sort of generic, and you won't stand out from the crowd. And the second is you can't really trust that the people who are giving you the answers to these questions are actually giving you the best possible answers. So while you should definitely look for the most common interview questions and try and prepare for those ahead of time, don't go and look for the answers to those questions, because it could just lead you down the wrong path. Next up, when you get to the actual interview, I want you to act as if every single person who you interact with is the most important person in the world. And that means being nice to the receptionist, to the janitor, to the person who offers you a cup of coffee or a glass of water. Every single person who works for the organization that you're interviewing with is a person who's already gotten a job there. You want that job, and so you need to give those people the proper respect because they have a position that at this point, frankly, you're envying. Remember that anyone who you interact with is a potential person who is going to make or influence the decision as to whether or not you get hired. Like I mentioned in the intro to this video, I have literally hired hundreds of employees. And one of the things that I often did in a lot of the companies I worked with is I would go to see the receptionist and ask them how the candidate acted before they walked into the interview room. The reason for this is really simple. A lot of people are really good at putting on a show for 30 to 60 minutes when they are in the actual interview process. But that's not always reflective of their true personality. And so when you only have a limited amount of time to make a judgment on someone, you want to get as many different opinions as possible. That's one of the reasons companies ask for references. But one of the other ways you can get a good view of someone's personality is to see how they treat the people who they don't necessarily think of as important, right? So remember that when you are interviewing at these companies, every single person you talk to is important, and treat them as such. This is also just good advice for life in general, quite frankly. Treat people well and it will come back and it will help you. It's good karma. But in the context of an interview, this is not just a nice idea. It is something that is going to be absolutely crucial, because if you're the type of person who comes in and you seem distracted or you're rude to the receptionist, that is something that could come back and bite you, even if you nail the interview and you hit it off really well with the interviewer. So keep that in mind as you go into your next interview. When you're in the interview itself, what I want you to do is to act like a politician. Now, that might sound like weird advice, but the next time you are watching the news or watching some sort of clip of politicians speaking, I want you to pay attention to the way that they answer questions. A politician is never going to answer the question that they're being asked. Instead, they're going to take that question as an opportunity to give the soundbite that they have already rehearsed. And so politicians are probably the best at doing this, or maybe the worst at doing this, because frankly, it's blatantly obvious. But what you want to do here is you want to make sure that you have prepared a list of items or a list of things or qualities or attributes that you want to get across to the interviewer. And regardless of the question that they're asking, you want to find a way to sort of slip that into the answer. So have a list of the 3 or 4 points that you absolutely want to make sure get treated in that interview. And even if they don't ask you questions about that thing specifically, I still want you to find a way to incorporate that into the answers that you're giving. So I'm not saying ignore the question that's being asked, but find a way to insert that into the answer. And again, if you need inspiration for how to do this, look up any single interview with a politician that you've ever seen, and you will see a masterclass in how to answer the question that you want to answer as opposed to the question that's actually asked. The next thing that you want to do when you're answering questions in an interview is you want to have some stories ready to go. And so if you've done your homework as to what questions are probably going to be answered, that means you have an idea of the types of answers you can be giving, so you can prepare some anecdotes, some stories in advance. The benefit of stories is that they make things more personal, and so it will seem like your answers are more concrete, and they're not just you spouting off some general information that you read off of Wikipedia. They will seem like things that you actually have experience doing. In addition to that, stories are just more engaging. It's more fun to listen to someone tell a story than to listen to someone just spout out random facts. So if you can, practice some stories of times where you executed the skill that you're trying to get across, and make sure you have got those stories. Now, the way you're going to deliver those stories is you're going to use something called the STAR system. Now, I'm not going to take credit for inventing the STAR system. I did not invent it. I don't know who did, but it's a well-known method of answering interview questions, and STAR is an acronym. The S stands for situation, T is for task, A is for action, and R is for result. So for any question that you're going to be given, instead of giving a 2-word answer as to what you would do in a specific situation, what you're going to do is you are going to think back to a time where this situation came up, and you are going to list out the situation. You're going to describe what the situation was in as short an amount of time as possible, because the situation isn't the important part here. Then you are going to describe the task that you were given. So here's what happened. I was working for this company, and we were coming up against a deadline, and we had to hit a certain quarterly revenue goal. And my boss came to me and he gave me the task of coming up with a plan to hit this within the next 24 hours. That's the situation and the task. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to describe the action. So what did you actually do? So I got this task from my boss. And so what I did was I proceeded to speak with the most important stakeholders. I assembled a plan. I forecasted what that could potentially give us in terms of a return on the efforts that we were going to put in. I structured it as a recommendation, and I delivered that to my boss. And then the R in the STAR system is for results. So what did you actually end up delivering in terms of results? And so after I delivered this report to my boss, he said, that's great, we're going to implement it. And 2 weeks later, it turned out that we hit our revenue goals after all, or we came up a little bit short, but here's what I learned from that. Whatever. The point is you are going to use this system to sort of structure your thoughts so that you are not rambling all over the place and either giving answers that are too short with not enough details, or that are just rambly and going off for 30 to 45 minutes answering the simple questions. So this star structure for giving your answers is a really effective way to give an answer in a way that feels natural, but also get all the right information across to the interviewer. Now, no matter how much prep you do, there's probably going to be at least one question in interview which is going to be something that you weren't prepared for, something that was unexpected. What often happens to a lot of candidates in this situation is they will panic, they get nervous, they freeze up, and then they'll start babbling or rambling, and their answer doesn't end up making a whole lot of sense, and it's a bad look. So instead of doing that, what you can do in an interview is say, that's a really great question. I hadn't thought of that. Let me take a moment to think about it. And it is perfectly acceptable for you to take a few seconds to gather your thoughts, come up with an answer, and then deliver that in a coherent way. No one is going to judge you for taking a 3 to 5 second pause. In fact, most interviewers will show that as a sign of poise and maturity. They won't look at it as, this person is completely unprepared. Now, the caveat to this is if you take 3 minutes to answer the question, it's going to start to get awkward. So you do have to be able to think on your feet a little bit. But do realize that it is okay to take a little bit of time to figure out what you're going to say before launching into an answer. I also just want to throw in a quick tip here about what not to do. You never want to speak negatively about a organization you worked with in the past or a person that you worked with in the past. And there's a few reasons you want to avoid this. The first is you want to avoid all forms of negativity in an interview because you want to come across as a person who is relatively positive, because in general, most people want to work with positive people. They don't want to work with negative people. The second is when you are being negative about someone else, you are really only talking about it from your perspective, and it will just come off as something that is vindictive. And the thought that's going to be going through the mind of the interviewer is likely going to be something along the lines of, well, if they talk this way about their last employer, what are they going to say about us when they leave our organization? And the last reason you want to avoid talking negatively about someone in an interview is the world of business is incredibly small. And so the likelihood that the person who's interviewing you actually knows the person you're speaking negatively about is not insignificant. And I've actually experienced this myself on a few occasions where I've had a candidate come into an interview, and when you ask them about their previous experiences or their previous roles, they talked about a manager or a person that they work with and that they didn't have a good time working with that person. They spoke really negatively about that person, unknowing that I actually knew this person personally, and maybe they were a good friend of mine, or maybe they were a colleague that I'd worked with in the past that I had a lot of respect for. And now suddenly they're bad-mouthing someone who I know way better than them. And so between them and the person they're bad-mouthing, who am I going to give more weight to? So you want to avoid those situations at all costs and never speak negatively about a previous employer. Now, there's one question that I really wish interviewers would stop asking, because at this point, I don't think anyone's getting any value of it, but a lot of them still ask it, and a lot of people still struggle in answering it. And that is the weakness question, the question about what are your greatest weaknesses? Now, this is a question that I think I first got when I applied to my very first job at a fast food restaurant when I was 15 years old, and I have still heard it said much, much later into my career. If you hear this question and you say, I'm going to give an answer that is sort of a weakness hidden in a strength, and you give the dreaded, I'm a perfectionist answer, that you are completely missing the point of this question. So what you need to do anytime you're answering an interviewer's question is you need to understand the intention behind the question. And the intention behind the weakness question is not to actually suss out what your weaknesses are, because no intelligent interviewer actually believes that you are going to come out and be like, here are the reasons I suck. No one is going to do that, right? So the reason that someone is going to ask you the weakness question, even though they know that you're not going to come out and reveal all your weaknesses to them, so they can then go and compare them to everyone else's weaknesses and give the job to the person with the least amount of weaknesses, doesn't make sense. So why are they asking this question? They're doing it because they want to check two things. One, they want to see if you are self-aware, because someone who is self-aware understands where they're strong and where they're weak. If you're not self-aware, then you believe you don't have any weaknesses, and that is a person who's just completely deluded, and that is the type of person who's never going to get any better because they don't understand that there's things they need to work on. The second thing they're trying to assess when you are naming weaknesses is not only am I aware of my weaknesses, but I am doing something to correct them. So the proper way to answer the weaknesses question is to identify things that you know you can be better at. You don't necessarily need to name things that you're terrible at, but name things that you know you can work on and then explain how you are improving them. That is one way that you can go about addressing the weaknesses question. The other way you can go about addressing the weaknesses question, and this might be more for more senior positions that may not be ideal for an entry-level position, but feel it out and kind of make a judgment call. The other way that you can address the weaknesses question is by acknowledging that there are certain traits that people have that are kind of mutually exclusive. So if you're the type of person who's very diligent, very organized, very focused, oftentimes that is also the same type of person who is not necessarily going to be very outgoing, very gregarious, a great salesperson. Okay, those are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they tend to be opposite sides of the same coin. So if I am a person who's really good at doing solo focused work for long periods of time, generally speaking, I'm not going to be this type of person who is really good at getting out there and shaking hands and opening sales deals. And understanding that you have a specific personality is something that you can talk about in an interview, especially if you know what skills and what traits the person is looking for in that interview, and you're actually matching up to one of those. Because again, the goal here is to say, I'm self-aware enough to know this is what I'm good at, and this is what I'm not good at, but you should also be talking about the things about how you mitigate those weaknesses, right? So if you're the type of person who's really good at doing focus work, but not so good at kind of getting out there at a cocktail and shaking hands and doing that kind of stuff, talk about some of the methods that you will mitigate that. You force yourself to make sure you have at least 3 quality conversations anytime you go to a networking event or something like that, right? Just make sure that you show that you're aware of the weakness and that you're doing something to address it. Now we're getting towards the end of the interview, and hopefully you've done a really good job preparing. You've answered all the questions with stories, and you used the STAR system, and you haven't said anything negative. You're going to get to the point of the interview now where the interviewer will ask you, do you have any questions for me? And this is a really great time for you to show that you stand out from the crowd, because the quality of your questions here will make a big difference in helping the interviewer determine whether or not you are going to be a good fit. So what you will want to avoid in this scenario is asking questions that are purely selfish in nature. What are the working conditions going to be like? How much do people get paid? How much vacation do I get? Those are not things that are going to make a positive impression on an interviewer, right? You can still ask those questions later on, and we're actually going to talk about that in my next tip. But at this point, what you want to do is you want to use this opportunity to show the interviewer that you are someone who's going to be really engaged. So good questions to ask are things like, what are you looking for from a candidate in this position? How can I make an impact in my first 3 weeks on the job? What do you think a person coming into this role is going to face as their single biggest challenge as they enter the role? These are the types of answers that are going to help you show to that interviewer that you're already thinking about how you can make an impact on their business. So it's not about you, it's about them, and that you can provide value to them. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about in the interview itself is what not to do, and what you don't want to do in the interview is you don't want to use the interview as a time to negotiate. So you're not going to use this time to negotiate your salary. You're not going to use this time to negotiate your time off. This is not the time or the place for that. And the simple reason for this is because while you're interviewing, you have zero bargaining power. The reality is, if you're in an interview process, there's a whole bunch of other candidates out there who also want the same job. And so you're competing against all of them for a scarce resource, which is the job. So if you try and negotiate in the interview process, essentially what you're doing is you're giving the interviewer a reason not to select you because other candidates may not have demands that are as high. To which you might answer, okay, Adam, but if I don't negotiate in the interview, what do I do? Do I just accept whatever offer they give me? No. What you're going to do is you're going to wait until you actually get to the offer stage, and that is the point at which you will negotiate. The reason for this being because when you are in the interview stage, you don't have any leverage. You're one of 5, 10, 15, 20 other candidates who are currently being interviewed. Once you get to the offer stage, you're no longer 1 out of 20, you're 1 of 1 because they're only going to make one offer for the job. So by the time you get the offer, the interviewer and the company have already made up their mind that you are the right person for this job. If they've made up their mind that you're the right person for this job, now you have leverage because now you've already proven to them you're the right person. So now is a good time for you to be able to say, thank you so much for the offer. I'm really excited to work with you. I was really looking for something more like this or that or something like that. So if you're going to negotiate your offer, you want to make sure you're waiting until the offer stage and you're not doing it at the interview stage. That being said, keep in mind that if you are interviewing for your first job, you probably don't have a whole lot of negotiating power at all. So you may not be able to negotiate at any stage in the process. And you may need to wait until you have a little bit more experience under your belt. And the last thing you want to do to ace your interview is to ace the follow-up. And so a follow-up to an interview is something as simple as an email within the next 24 hours, thanking the interviewer for their time, letting them know that you had a really good conversation. If you really want to push it to the next level, maybe you use that as an opportunity to show your interest based on, maybe there's something you discussed in the interview that really got your mind going. And so then you went to do some research and learn some stuff, and you might want to share that knowledge. That is not necessary. It's gravy. At the bare minimum, though, you do want to make sure that you send a thank you email within 24 hours because, again, this is something that not a lot of people do, surprisingly, and so it will help you stand out a little bit. The other part of follow-up that is completely okay to do is if you haven't heard back from an interviewer in a while, there is absolutely nothing wrong with waiting a week or two. And if you haven't heard anything, reaching out and saying, hey, I just wanted to check in to see if you guys have made a decision yet. And more often than not, what you'll find out is they're still going through the process. Maybe they got backed up with hiring for a different role or something like that, and so they haven't made a decision yet. But you reaching out and saying, I'm still interested, sends a good signal. It shows that you're engaged. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask where someone's at in terms of the hiring process. Now, you'll only get an interview if you have nailed the first step of the hiring process, which is having a really good resume. So if you haven't yet, make sure you check out my video on how to create a resume that's sure to get you an interview. And if you haven't already, I would highly recommend you subscribe to the channel to check out other lessons that you probably should have learned in school but haven't. And until next time, cheers.